Hey folks, so while I know some of you are here for my general insight into gaming, some of you are just here to watch me get smeared and suffer, and welp, I've got good news for both parties, because a while back I received a review copy of Tim Ruswick's Philophobia, The Fear of Love. That's not me explaining it, that's part of the title. Anyway, this challenging precision platformer falls a bit outside of the normal purview of games I play, partly because it happily embraces being a rage game. Still, there have been vicious puzzle platformers I've found myself enamored with before, which begs the question. Did I walk away from Philophobia heartbroken, or did I ultimately have nothing to fear? I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. Love. It's a curious concept. It comes easily to some of us, others have to fight for it. But even finding it has its dangers. Because to know love is to know heartache, and even heartbreak. A fact our melancholy protagonist discovers after his beloved runs off for another. Still, he's not one to waste unnecessary time in introspection, oh no. Instead, he chooses a far more proactive decision. He gets out a noose and speedruns a path towards a potentially literal emotional hell. It's only here that he finally stops to try and make sense of the events that have occurred, in essence doing his best to work through the myriad stages of grief, and, look for an escape from all the self-induced emotional torment he's now subject to. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I might be a complete bastard, because despite the gravity of the game's subject matter, I may have taken an undue amount of amusement out of the overall delivery of the game's narrative. Whether it was the opening story cutscene or each of the following ones that appeared at the end of a chapter, I found myself charmed by the combination of edginess and hamminess that permeated the plot, especially given that it's delivered in rhyming couplets. And yet, whilst its narrative may have induced a few cackles on my part, the gameplay was more often than not a source of gritted teeth and clenched fists. See, Philophobia leans on a particular brand of mechanical sadism, being a stage-based puzzle platformer that perversely punishes your myriad errors with instant death. Though, it doesn't quite start out that way. If anything, it's deceptively forgiving at the onset, tasking you with simply making your way to readily accessible exits to move on to the next stage. Though they don't really stay that way. For one thing, your ability to see in Philophobia is very limited, as your vision is easily obstructed, making it very difficult to gauge where you need to go or what sort of obstacles are around the corner or even beneath you. Which can get pretty lethal given that you'll be introduced to all sorts of death traps and hostile creatures within each of the various layers of emotional hell. This gradual intensification of your obstacles hardly stops there either. For one thing, the game introduces another snarl in its design fairly early on, as it begins to oblige players to seek out keys in order to unlock the way out. Admittedly, this is a bit hard at times given the combination of traps and poor visibility factor into the fact that you also lose the key if you die, and you have a wretched recipe for repetition, the likes of which the game will sadistically play with later on given that certain puzzles will make the path forward devilishly hard, and acquiring the key will oftentimes lock you out of certain paths. Honestly, given how brutal the game is with its core gameplay, I found myself legitimately surprised at how forgiving it was with its hidden collectibles. See, scattered across the various stages are two types of items to find. Broken hearts, one of which can be found in every stage, and lost souls, which are far more sparsely scattered. Whilst these can be fiendishly squirreled away in all corners of the map, they don't feel like a nuisance to hunt down given that in their case, your progress is saved even if you die so long as you pick it up. Admittedly, I don't know what collecting them actually does beyond achievements, even though I went out of my way to collect all of the heart fragments, and while I tried to do the same for the lost souls, well, unlike heart fragments, the game doesn't show which stages have one or whether you've collected or not. So, I was not gonna go and brute force check every single stage for the ones left over. Nah. Though, also, speaking of achievements, I have to admit that I was a bit cheesed at the deathless achievements, and that's mostly because there's a few scripted segments meant to startle and murder you dead. Which meant that it was actually pretty challenging to figure out what stages you were actually meant to clear consecutively, because certain ones would just sort of kill you almost unavoidably. And honestly, compared to that hardship, the game's boss encounters were relaxing. I mean, sure, they were all pretty grueling endeavors, and a few of them murdered me upwards of 50 times, but they were neat challenges to figure out and overcome, although I will also be the first to admit that the final boss feels a bit tedious. It's essentially a very long chase scene in the vein of an earlier encounter. Thankfully, there are checkpoints during this, but it might be a while until you reach them, given it's a pretty exact bit of fleeing for your life. Though maybe it just stuck it in my mind as such a grueling trial because I was stuck listening to an angsty poem every time I tried to progress forward. Actually, yeah, that was probably it, though that's not to say I have issues with the game's sound design. It's decent throughout, with the voice acting generally being better than I expected. Honestly, what threw me for a loop was the visual design, and I don't just mean the decision to have your vision obstructed by a solid object. Like, yes, that did mess with me, but the overall effect of the shadowed areas sliding around also heavily messed with my ability to gauge the actual width of objects I was platforming along, requiring a pretty hefty adjustment period for me to actually get good at coordinating jumps, especially in areas with narrow platforms. Beyond that though, well, it's alright. Which means it's time to get down to the brass tacks and give my final thoughts, and overall, I don't mind this. There were a few times when I felt things were a bit clumsy, and growing accustomed to the visual elements did take time for me, especially given the game's nature as a precision platformer. Still, I found myself relishing the challenge as I continue to crawl forward through Philophobia's content. I enjoyed the puzzles it provided me to peruse, even if I did find myself trying my best to frantically survive at the same time. And the slow trickle of new obstacles to overcome alongside the game's relative length meant things did stay fresh for me. If anything, one of my biggest mechanical regrets was the simple fact that even though you do gradually unlock a block button, a dash, and a boomerang to hit switches with, you can't actually take these back with you to earlier stages, which would have been nice for secret hunting. That said, once I'd cleared the game, I didn't really feel overly compelled to dive back in to discover those last few secrets it held. And I don't just mean because it would have boiled down to brute force searching. More or less, while Philophobia was an alright way for me to keep busy for close to 5 hours, I'd still find myself hard-pressed to recommend to people who aren't fans of puzzle platformers, which is why I'd ultimately rate it as a fumble. Though, for the folks in the audience who thrive playing games that will slap you around, this is apt to be right up your alley. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you have an interest in supporting my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know when there's a new release. There's also a Discord, links in the description, so you can become a part of our community, the Crit Hit Cauldron. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.